Hi guys, welcome to Out the Seams Patterns. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial on the Chloe Sleepwear top. The top features a feminine rounded collar with piping detail. The piping detail carries across to the sleeve and patch pocket. Suitable for more advanced sewers, this top requires some harder sewing skills, including a set-in sleeve, collar, button and buttonholes, and piping. Fabric and notions required: lightweight breathable fabric, lightweight interfacing, thread to match, 4 buttons, contrast piping. The equipment needed: scissors, pins, sewing machine. A zipper or invisible zipper foot can make the piping easier, an overlocker and an iron. Cut all main and interfacing pieces accurately on the correct grain, ensuring all notches are clipped and pattern markings have been transferred. Seam allowance is included and is marked on the pattern in a grey dashed line. It is also listed on page 2 of the booklet supplied. Heat press the interfacing to the front neck facing and collar pieces and then set them aside to cool down. Taking one of the collar pieces, pin the piping along the outside edge of the collar. Stitch to secure using a large stitch and an 8mm seam allowance. Then place the other collar piece on top, right sides together. Pin along the outside edge with the bias piping sandwiched in between. Sew along the outside edge using a 1cm seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance back to 5mm, then clip the curves and turn through. Press neatly, then set aside. Next, the edges of the front neck facing need to be finished. Overlock from the right side of the facing from the shoulder to the hem, then set aside. On the front bodice, sew the bust darts on each side. Press the excess fabric down towards the waist. Next, pin the shoulder seams of the front bodice and the back yoke right sides together. Stitch closed with a 1 cm seam allowance, then press the seam allowance open. Repeat step 7 with the second back yoke and front facing pieces. Pin the piping along the front neck edge of the bodice from the hem to the notch point on the front neck. At the notch point on the neck, run the piping off the edge of the fabric. Stitch to secure using a larger stitch and an 8mm seam allowance. Then pin the collar to the neck edge. Use the collar notch, the shoulder seam notches and the centre back notches to correctly place the collar. Take care not to stretch the neck edges. If you are using a lightweight fabric, this edge can be stay stitched if needed. Then place the facing piece down right sides together with the main and pin from the hem along the centre front across the back neck and down the other side. And stitched closed with a 1 cm seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance back to 6 to 7 millimeters around the corners, then clip the curves, turn through and press well. To attach the lower back bodice, we are going to use the burrito method to encase the seam allowance. Start by pinning the lower bodice to the outer back yoke, right sides together. Then gently roll the back bodice up into the yoke and fold the inner yoke to pin to the other side. Stitch the seam closed with a 1 cm seam allowance. Turn the garment through so that it is the correct way out and press the back yoke seam. If this is done correctly, all seam allowance should be hidden so it will not need to be overlocked. Next, pin the front and back side seams right sides together. Stitched closed using a 1.5 cm seam allowance. There is extra seam allowance added here in case you need to make any sizing adjustments. Overlock the seam closed and press the seam allowance towards the back. Turn the facing back onto the bodice so that right sides are together. Then stitch across the facing 2 centimeters from the hem and cut off the corner. Fold the hem over to make a 1 centimeter double turn hem across the whole bottom edge of the garment. Turn the corner of the facing back the right way, ensuring the corner is nice and sharp. Then top stitch the hem down. The bodice can now be set aside to prepare the sleeves. Start by folding the sleeves right sides together and pin the inseams closed. Stitch closed with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, then overlock and press the seam allowance towards the back of the sleeve. Then fold the sleeve hem pieces right sides together and stitch the inseam closed with the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam allowance open. There is no need to overlock these edges. Fold the sleeve hem in half long ways and press. Then fold a 1 centimeter seam allowance on the lower edge and press. Then pin the piping to the lower edge of the sleeve and stitch in place using a large stitch and an 8mm seam allowance. The overlap of the piping should be at the inseam so that it is hidden when the garment is worn. Then place the sleeve hem on top of the sleeve right sides together with the bias piping sandwiched in between and pin in place, taking care to ensure that the sleeve inseams match. Stitch close with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and press the seam allowance towards the sleeve hem, taking care not to press out the folds created in step 22. Then fold over the hem so that the seam allowance is encased. Pin from the right side of the sleeve to hold it in place, then check the back to ensure that it is folded neatly. Then top stitch from the right side of the sleeve 1 to 2 millimeters below the piping to secure the back of the sleeve hem. The sleeve head has 1.5 to 2 centimeters excess that will need to be eased into the armhole. Run 2 rows of gather stitch across the top of the sleeve head. Pin the sleeve into the armhole of the bodice, right sides together. This step is easier if you turn the bodice inside out and keep the sleeve the correct way. Pin the bodice side seam and sleeve inseam together, then the shoulder seam and top sleeve head notch, and then the front notches and then the back notches. Then use the gathering threads to ease the sleeve head into the bodice. Add additional pins where you need. Stitched closed using a 1 cm seam allowance. Sewing from the side of the sleeve makes it easier to ensure you have no tucks when easing the sleeve head into the armhole. Overlock closed and then press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. To add the piping to the pocket, it will be a similar finish to the sleeve hem. Fold the upper pocket in half and press, then fold the top edge 1 cm seam allowance over and press. Place the lower and upper pocket right sides together along the piping edge with the bias piping sandwiched in between, and stitch closed using a 1 cm seam allowance. Press the seam allowance towards the upper pocket, taking care not to press out the folds created previously. Then fold the upper pocket over to encase the seam allowance. Pin from the right side of the pocket to hold in place, then check the back to ensure that it is folded neatly. Top stitch 1 to 2 mm above the piping to secure the back edge of the pocket. Fold in the sides and bottom edge 1 cm and press. Then open out the corners and fold them back on a 45-degree angle, then repress the side seams. This reduces the bulk on the corners and ends up being much neater. Pin the pocket to the bodice using the markings provided on the pattern. Top stitch the pocket to the bodice 1 to 2 mm from the pocket edge along the sides and across the bottom. The next step is to add the buttonholes. These will be on the wearer's right hand side. Each machine is different, so I recommend doing a couple of test runs on some scrap fabric before putting them onto your actual garment. Be sure to use the same scrap fabric that your garment is made out of. Once the buttonholes are complete, cut them open, taking care not to slice through the end of the stitching. Lastly, attach the buttons to the wearer's left-hand side.